We have had a wonderful morning session with Professor Eric Weitz, Professor Laura Edwards, and our luncheon speaker, Professor Gordon Woods. My name is Samer Shahata, and I teach Middle East politics in the College of International Studies. And I am pleased that you are here to join us at OU's teach-in, focusing on the strength and fragility of constitutions. It is now my pleasure to introduce Soner Cagaptay. Dr. Cagaptay is the Bayer Family Fellow and Director of the Turkish Research Program at the Washington Institute. Professor Cagaptay has written extensively on U.S.-Turkish relations, Turkish domestic politics, and Turkish nationalism. He's published widely in both scholarly and academic journals, and also the press, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and his most recent book, quite timely, published some months ago, is entitled The New Sultan, Erdogan and the Crisis of Modern Turkey. He has taught courses at Yale, Princeton, Georgetown, and Smith, and Professor Cagaptay is also the recipient of numerous honors, grants, and awards from the Smith-Richardson Foundation, Mellon, Rice, as well as previously holding the Erdogan Chair at Princeton University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Soner Cagaptay.
Thank you so much, Samir. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here for this teaching today on constitutional issues. We've heard this morning about American constitutionalism as well as case studies of Germany. My job, of course, this afternoon is to talk to you about Turkey and the crisis that faces Turkey. But let me tell you, first of all, how happy I am to be at this school, which, as we heard from President Boren at lunch, has the happiest students in America. So, very great to be here. Talk to you about Turkey, really, to start with. The main character of my discussion this afternoon is going to be Turkey's President, Erdogan. He's run Turkey since 2002, when he became its leader through his party, Justice and Development Party, also known as AKP. Erdogan is one of the most consequential leaders of the 21st century in the Middle East and probably in the world, because he has completely transformed Turkey and also leading the country now into a major crisis. I should teach you some Turkish before I get started. So Erdogan's name, E-R-D-O-G-A-N. You don't say Erdogan because it has a letter that's known as silent G in Turkish. It has an accent mark over it. That's the G in the middle. So it's E-R-D-O-G, silent G-A-N. I'm now going to teach you how to say silent G in Turkish. I just said it. Right. So Erdogan with a silent G is the most powerful Turkish leader. He's the country's president. He just won a referendum recently, which gave him additional powers. Turkey's system had different offices for head of state and head of government until this referendum in April. And in the referendum that he won by a thin majority, he's consolidated those two offices. He's head of state and head of government, as well as head of ruling party. So he is the most powerful Turkish politician since Mustafa Kemal Ataturk established Turkey as a modern, secular European republic almost about 100 years ago. Erdogan is therefore an incredibly powerful politician because he's amassed all this power, of course, democratically, but he's also leading the country into a very serious political crisis. It's really an important, interesting case. But before I get to it, I'll, of course, want to look at some of the other parts of his legacy. Of course, the dark part of his legacy is this deep crisis that he's thrown the country into. And the better part, or the more brighter part of his legacy, is that Erdogan has also delivered Turkey a phenomenal period of economic growth. In fact, I wrote a book about this before this one, The New Sultan. And this is called The Rise of Turkey. I wrote about 5 years ago. I looked at Turkey's dramatic economic transformation under him in the last decade. How many of you have been to Turkey? Quite a few. So if you haven't been to, you should go and see it. It's a great country. But make sure you like eggplant. Turks have a million ways of preparing eggplant. You'll starve. So if you went to Turkey in the 90s and if you went to Turkey recently, it's a dramatically transformed country economically. That's all because of him. He's done really well on that side. economic good governance, attracting a lot of foreign direct investment, incomes have increased, infrastructure has improved, people live better off in general, and that's one reason he wins elections. So in my previous book, I looked at this economic transformation, and I wanted to give him some credit. I said, look, he's done so well for Turkey economically. He'll go down in history as the guy who transformed Turkey economically. He also has a chance to go down in history as the guy who transformed Turkey politically. I said to that end, he needs to write a new liberal democratic constitution. Because Turkey has, for the lack of a better word, two disparate halves, a secular and a religious half, and they can't agree on the role of religion in education and politics and society. And I said there's a way to arrange for that. Erdogan's new constitution needs to provide freedom of religion for the pious half and freedom from religion for the secular half. Simultaneously, it can work. I said the same constitution should also provide for wide individual liberties, including wide freedoms for the Kurds, which would end Turkey's own struggles with the Kurds in the country, as well as fight with the Kurds in the Middle East, and relieved of its perennial secular versus religious tensions and fights with the Kurds, then Turkey would soar, and it would, of course, dramatically transform. I don't think Erdogan read my book, so I wrote this one, which I'm going to show to you. It's called The New Sultan. It's also on the screen. And it's about the crisis that faces Turkey. So why is Turkey in a crisis? Erdogan has done well economically, but as I said, that's his brighter side. His darker side is that he's the prototype of right-wing populist leaders globally. And he's been doing this for the last 15 years. Since he came to power, he has a track record of demonizing, brutalizing, and cracking down on groups that are not likely to vote for him. He went after secularists first, then the list included liberals, leftists, social democrats, socialists, Kurds, Alevis. Alevis are liberal Muslims. They're sort of the Unitarian Universalists of Islam. When you add these groups up, you get nearly half of Turkish society. Groups that have been brutalized by him, that he has demonized, that he has regularly cracked down. Yet at the same time, he's also built a power base through economic growth, but a base that is mostly composed of conservative Turks. So the country is deeply divided between a very staunchly pro-Erdogan half that likes him. That includes a lot of people he has lifted out of poverty. And the other half, composed of disparate groups that loathes him, which feels many members of which feel that they have been demonized and by him, as well as the fact that they loathe him. So it's completely polarized society. In fact, the most recent referendum that I talked about, Erdogan won it, but by a very narrow victory, 51%. That's the referendum that basically gave him all these executive powers of head of state, head of government, head of ruling party. It did overlap with the launch of the new Sultan the same week, so I wanted to send him a thank you note to say, thank you, President Erdogan, for timing the referendum with the launch of my book. But it helped him become very powerful, but the problem for Erdogan is that half of the country that loathes him will never fold under him, although the half that likes him, of course, likes everything that he has delivered. And what I argue in the new Sultan is that Erdogan is actually using what I call the Ataturk model of social engineering in Turkey. What is the Ataturk model? Ataturk established Turkey 100 years ago. He wanted to shape Turkey in his own image. This is the Jacobin model of social engineering, top-down, using education, public policy, state resources. And Ataturk's image was that Ataturk believed that Turkey had to be secular, Western, and European. And he used state policy, education, government resources to shape generations of Turks in his own image. Now, Erdogan wants to do the same, minus the values. He wants to shape Turkey in his own image, but the opposite of Ataturk's values. He wants to make it conservative, politically Islamist, and directionally Middle Eastern. He also wants to use state resources, education policy, and government, of course, public policy to shape the country in his own image. The problem for the Ataturk model now is that its time has passed, of course. You don't do this kind of social engineering, but also Ataturk's Turkey was only 11% literate. This is in the 1920s. And most educated Turks supported him. Erdogan's Turkey is 97% literate and most educated Turks do not support him. So he faces a democratic mandate in which most educated, wealthy people don't support him, and the country is very split. Let me just show you this chart. This shows you a map of Turkey, which has 81 provinces. It's the breakdown of the most recent referendum. Blue represents for Erdogan, and the other is against him. You kind of see it's like our country. The coast is more liberal in Turkey in general, so the coast has voted against him. The inner parts of the country is more conservative. They've voted for him. What for you is the lower right-hand corner of the map. Those are the Kurdish areas. Istanbul is in the upper left-hand corner. Of course, that's Turkey in Europe. And the country's Aegean coast is on the west, and the Mediterranean coast is to the south. What is really interesting, of course, is the breakdown of the provinces. You got nearly 52% that voted for him and 48% that voted against him. But the provinces that voted against him together represent 73% of Turkey's economy. So Turkey's wealth is not voting for him. More importantly, this is a breakdown of the voters based on age in the same referendum. It has 3 demographic blocks, 18 to 32, 33 to 48, and 42 and above. He lost the referendum only in the 18 to 32 years old group. Why is that significant? If you're 18 to 30-year-old Turkish citizen now, you were 3 to 15 years old when he came to power. Those are the people who grew up under him, and ironically, those are the people who are less likely to support him. So the people he's raising are the people who are actually less likely to support him, and that's his challenge. He sees that this model of social engineering, using state policy to shape citizens in his own image, the Ataturk model in quotes, is not working anymore. So I argue that going forward, there's only one way for him to become more autocratic and to erode democratic institutions, because he's going to lose. At this track, given the trends, demographic bulge is going to be even bigger against him in 2 years. And that's one reason going forward, his track is to become more authoritarian. There are other reasons why I think his authoritarianism is going to increase. One of the issues I grappled with in my book was to look at why Erdogan is the person that he is. And I argue that understanding him goes through understanding his upbringing in what used to be a secularist society in Turkey. Turkey's model for maintaining or regulating the relationship between government and state is modeled after the European system. Of course, Ataturk established Turkey as a state crafted after the European model, remember? And the European system is different than ours. It's called the laïcité in French, which means there should be no religion in education or politics. That was the country Erdogan was raised. But he was born in 1954 to a pious, poor, and conservative family. So people like his family felt that they were second class because they wanted to wear religion on their sleeve and they could not. And therefore, I think he felt fundamentally marginalized growing up in Turkey for the first 49 years of his life. Then he comes to power and becomes prime minister. He's in charge, and he wants to turn the tables upside down. But of course, that suggests that maybe part of the reason why he's acting the way he is because of where he is coming from. I think the fact that he felt profoundly marginalized growing up. But there are other reasons why his authoritarianism is going to be around. I write in the new Sultan, one of them is that Erdogan has stepped on so many toes, locked up so many dissidents, and hurt so many people that he fears and knows that he ever loses elections, he'll be both prosecuted and persecuted. So he cannot lose elections ever again, which means he will end democracy going forward, because that's rational for him. Although it looks irrational to us, it's rational for him. It's the only way he can prevent persecution or prosecution by the many opponents he has jailed and whose toes he has stepped on. And I think that's a really, really sad conclusion for Turkey going forward, but it also suggests that in these fragile constitutional democracies, once leaders cross that path of becoming authoritarian, it's really hard for them to go back, because they know that once they do injustices to others, they'll be punished for it. So they rather keep winning elections, and the key to winning elections, of course, is eroding democratic institutions and checks and balances, which is what Erdogan has been doing since the last few years. The coup of last year, of course, was an important event, right? This was a failed coup. It tried to oust Erdogan. It was an interesting affair because it was a military coup. It looked like it, but it was actually part of the military that tried to oust Erdogan, but also attack the other parts of the military. The coup was led, we believe, by a group of people aligned with what is called an Islamic movement called the Gülen movement, whose leader lives in the United States, in Pennsylvania. Officers aligned with the movement, there's consensus in Washington, formed the backbone of the coup effort. I can go into Q&A about this difference between Erdogan and Gülen, but it suffices to say that they were allies for a long time, and this is just an internal conflict they had. A coup was, thank God, unsuccessful. Erdogan could have emerged from the coup as a unifier, and the whole nation was united around him, but he did not. He actually used the powers given to him after the coup, including state of emergency, to crack down further on his opposition for the reasons that I've highlighted, that he knows that if he loses elections, he'll be prosecuted. And therefore, I think the coup has only seen a further acceleration of Turkey's authoritarian slide. So what does that leave us with to wrap up? One, of course, is that Turkey is in a very deep constitutional crisis. It's a polarized society where half adore this president and the other half loathe him, and there's nothing in the middle. It's very easy. If you have Turkish counterparts, if you want to figure out their political colors, but you don't want to ask the question of how they feel about Erdogan, I'll give you a tool. You ask your friends, you say, compare pre-Erdogan Turkey to Turkey now, and they'll either tell you it was heaven and he made it hell, or it was hell and he made it heaven. No country is like that, we know that. So obviously it shows you there is no middle ground, and that's Turkey's crisis. The crisis is exacerbated by the fact that while half of the country loves him, he wants to shape all of it in his own image. But yet he has a democratic mandate. He'll be voted out, and the other part of the population will not agree. So the second trajectory I lay forward is that he will end democracy going forward, and he'll erode democratic institutions further. But the third is an extension of the second. The half of the country that loathes him will never accept him or him ending democracy. So there's a point, of course, where I hope not, but there's a point where I could see this half giving up on democracy and saying, what's the point? You can't vote him out. There's some consensus in Washington that the most recent referendum was rigged. It was the first time elections would be rigged in Turkey, if that's the case. Turkey has had free and fair elections longer than has had Spain since 1950, and that'll be unfortunate. But if you're in the anti-Erdogan bloc, and you feel that he's rigging elections, you also feel that he's curbing your freedoms, at what point do you give up on democracy? And I think that's a very dangerous threshold, because it would invite in violent radicalization against him among many groups. He has foreign enemies that are waiting on the sidelines for him to fail. The biggest enemy is Russia, Turkey's historic nemesis. The Russians, of course, are fighting Erdogan now in a proxy war in Syria, where Turkey supports the rebels and Russia supports the Assad regime. Putin is very unhappy with that. And the Russians are Turkey's historic enemy. The Ottoman Empire, that is the Turks, and the Russian Empire became neighbors in 1470s when the Crimean Khanate joined the Ottoman Empire as part of a commonwealth. So when Putin invaded Crimea and said it should go to Russia because it's originally Russian, I wanted to write him a letter and said, it's really Tatar if you want to go there, ethnically speaking. So Tatars are Turkic people. They're sort of like Highland Scots to Scots, more tribal but still kind of Turkish. So Crimea joins the Ottoman Empire. Turks and Russians become neighbors. From then on until the end of the Russian Empire in 1917, the Ottomans and the Russians fought at least 17 major campaigns. Anybody wants to guess who started all of them? The Russians. Anybody wants to guess who lost all of them? The Turks. So Erdogan does not want an 18th battle he would lose. Of course, Russia, I think, wants him to fail because they want to humiliate him for their policy of trying to challenge Putin's policies in Syria. So the threats are numerous. There's a Kurdish group called PKK, which is on the State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations. They have carried out attacks against Turkey. There's ISIS, which carries out attacks against Turkey. There are many reasons why I'm worried. But I'm an optimist, and I don't want to leave the conversation or bring it to an end just with these three bleak scenarios of crisis, Erdogan ending democracy, that is leading to conflict. I hope not. And the fourth scenario I want to share with you is, I call it, I don't want to tell you all about it because I want you to buy my book, but I'll give it in a little bit. The fourth scenario is what's called the despite Erdogan, but thanks to Erdogan scenario. What is thanks to Erdogan? He lifted people out of poverty. He made Turkey a middle-class place. When he came to power in 2002, infant mortality rate in Turkey was comparable to pre-war Syria. That is pre-war Syria. That was in 2002. Now, the same rate, infant mortality rate, is comparable to Spain. So the Turks live like the Syrians. Now they live like the Spanish, which is why he wins, but which is also a really great thing because it means middle-class wealth has spread around the country. And that also means you got now a really middle-class base of people making some very middle-class demands for freedoms of expression, association, assembly, as well as media, gender equality and respect for the environment. And I think that's Erdogan's challenge going forward. But I'm not holding my breath on this last trajectory because the opposition is composed of disparate groups of Turkish and Kurdish nationalists, seculars and conservatives. They're divided and they lack a charismatic leader. The half of the country that likes Erdogan has their leader. It's Erdogan. The half of the country that doesn't like him had a leader. His name is Ataturk. He died. And in his absence, I think they need a charismatic leader to unite them. So until that moment, I think Turkey, unfortunately, remains in its crisis. Why is all of this important? It's about Turkey. It's an important ally. It's the only NATO ally in the Middle East that we have. It borders Iran, Iraq, Syria, Russia, and ISIS. So whatever U.S. policies are regarding those five countries and entities, they're much easier to implement with Turkey. So Turkey is an important country. But I think this discussion is also important because it shows to us that democracies do not die with a bang. Here's what I mean by that. There's a lot of scholarship and research done on how authoritarian regimes become democracies. Countries in Eastern Europe, for example, and that always requires what I call a bang moment, which means there's an historic incident you know. The fall of the wall, the fall of the dictator. You know when an authoritarian country becomes democracy. It's clear there's an historic threshold. The opposite is never clear. When a democracy becomes authoritarian, it happens so gradually, Turkey, that one morning you wake up and it's no more a democracy, and that's the case of Turkey. So I think it's a really interesting case to study, showing that democracies are fragile, and as in the case of Turkey, and they can be converted into authoritarian regimes by charismatic populist leaders who undermine democratic institutions and constitutional regimes. And it happens so gradually that there is no bang moment, but that, of course, you got to trace these developments. So I hope that, of course, Turkey's future is a little bit brighter than that. I think that the fourth trajectory outlined for you, that this will be a country in which Erdogan's economic success will ultimately be his nemesis and will provide a check and balance as well as a middle-class balance, will be there to keep Turkey together. But for the time being, this is my next book project. So I realize writing books, sort of like having kids. It takes you 1 year to make it, 1 year to forget how difficult it was, another year to plan, and a fourth year to write it. So in 4 years, I'm going to write the case for a liberal Turkey, and maybe I'll come back and discuss it with you guys. And thank you so much.